Hi, my name is Nick Ford. I am an audio/visual coordinator at the Center for Stateless Society. I'm also left-libertarian. I'm very excited today to introduce to you James Tuttle. James Tuttle is a current director of C4SS, also considers himself a left-libertarian and an anarcho-ostromite. He's an organizer of the industrial workers of the world. Today he's presenting on his ideas on Freed Market Anti-Capitalism. He's offering an introduction to left-libertarianism and free markets and how we can see it through a more left analysis. So, James Tuttle.
Hello, okay. Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, so hello. I'd like to first take a moment to thank Chris Lawless and the Liberty Forum for taking a chance on me, and Nick Ford for having faith in me. So, to start off, in Ken MacLeod's novel, The Star Fraction, we come across the following passage. What we always meant by socialism wasn't something you forced on people. It was people organizing themselves as they pleased into co-ops, collective, communes, unions. And if socialism really is better, more efficient than capitalism, then it can bloody well compete with capitalism. So we decided, forget all of the status stuff and the violence. The best place for socialism is the closest to a free market you can get. From this, MacLeod identifies two oppositional economic arrangements, socialism versus capitalism, and differentiates two institutional spaces, the free market and the state. The title of my presentation is The Center for Stateless Society, C4SS, and Freed Market Anti-Capitalism. I hope to offer an introduction to a left-libertarian conception of political economy that has emerged from many collaborative and challenging conversations within the market anarchist milieu, known as free market capitalism. So, I would like to start out by talking about the C4SS, its missions and successes. Then I would like to present a couple of themes to orient our approach to this subject and clarify a number of terms found in a typical left-libertarian critique. And finally, discuss how these change the way we talk about markets, with a focus on breaking down the time-honored notion of the invisible hand into an antagonistic invisible fist versus the resistant invisible Molotov. My particular approach to traditional libertarian puzzles is heavily influenced by the work of Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. This Ostromite approach focuses on puzzles of institutional analysis and development, institutional economics, uses of a version of methodological individualism, and has a respect for praxeological or hermeneutic issues without fully endorsing or committing to any. C4SS, according to our About page, is an anarchist think tank and media center. Its mission is to explain and defend the idea of a vibrant social cooperation without aggression, oppression, or centralized authority. In particular, it seeks to enlarge public understanding and transform public perceptions of anarchism while reshaping academic and movement debate through the production and distribution of market anarchist media content, through scholarly and popular, both scholarly and popular, the organization of events, and the development of networks and communities, and to serve along with the Alliance of the Libertarian Left and the Molinari Institute, an institutional home for left-libertarian market anarchism. C4SS was born October 10th, 2006, with the following press release: Anarchists launch major media offensive. This press release quotes Molinari Institute President Roderick T. Long, quote, for too long, libertarians, and I mean anarchist libertarians, have treated market anarchism almost as an esoteric doctrine. It's time to put market anarchism front and center in our educational efforts and to start making it familiar and recognizable, a familiar and recognizable position. And Brad Spangler, the first director of C4SS, added, with C4SS, we aim to awaken more Americans than ever before to the brutal reality that all government everywhere are essentially nothing more than murderous bandit groups, or murderous bandit gangs,
and show them the shining light of hope for a world without the state. Since October 2006, C4SS has published over 2,200 articles to include 15 academic level studies. We have documented over 700 plus reprints of our articles in mainstream media outlets. C4SS articles have been translated by volunteers into French, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, Russian, Spanish, and Swedish. And we have media coordinators for our Spanish and Dutch translations. And C4SS is the proud institutional home of the innovative and prolific Kevin Carson. I'm not sure what the metrics for success for the fringe of the fringe of the fringe of political theory, but considering that we pay our writers, we are financed through micro-donations and partnerships, and are additionally staffed by enthusiastic volunteers and supporters like myself, I feel we can reasonably claim a little success. Thematically, as I understand it, the freed market anti-capitalist conception of political economy can develop along the following lines. DIFARA is just an acronym for damage identified, find a route around, and SPIMEC, state by monocentrism. As with most vulnerable and conditional systems, the ability to see and move are crucial. But seeing correctly and moving concordantly with a goal, not just away from danger, are just as important. One can immediately see the peril and folly inherent in leaping off a cliff in order to avoid one's own shadow. The ability to acknowledge and identify danger, whatever it may be, is worthless if we cannot act to avoid or change it. Yet all the mobility and flexibility in the world is equally worthless if we don't know what we want, what's in our way, and how it's in our way. Within fourth generational warfare and open source insurgency discussions, DIFARA, damage identified, can be closely aligned with the Boyd cycle, or the OODA loop: observe, orient, act, decide, or decide and act, and then you can reflect and repeat. The quicker and more accurately one can move through this loop and repeat, the greater your chances of success. And if you are in a contest with another individual or organization, the more likely you are to set the terms and tempo of the match. The modern Westphalian police state has a very tight decide-act loop, because it tends to default to everything that is not me is my enemy, so kill it with fire. This may explain the anxiety and desire stress, the emergency heart attack that experienced by activists. Activists tend to have a very tight observe and orient loop, yet have paralyzed, inoperable, or slow decide-act loops. Imagine, as I'm sure you have, being able to see a problem and recognize its relationship to you, but unable to decide what to do quickly enough to act appropriately or effectively. The anarchist author and activist Scott Crow describes anarchism in very DIFARA terms. He quote, "Anarchism means not waiting for others to do something. It means knowing what the right thing to do is, recognizing you have the power to do it, then doing it." Open source insurgency streamlines a number of the features of the OODA loop by focusing on virtualization, repetition, and release early, release often, deployment development strategies. If we are good at the observe and orient, then why not streamline the decide and act? But organizational or institutional streamlining runs a risk, which leads us to the SPIMEC, state by monocentrism. Generally, the state is regarded as a territorial or jurisdictional monopoly on the use of force. Most libertarian projects focus on delegitimizing or reducing this use of force, which is good, but a closer look at monopolies, what they are, how they shape and constrain, and how they creep into our institutions is just as important. Murray Rothbard takes Robert Nozick to task in his essay, The Immaculate Conception of the State, over Nozick's fable regarding how a state could be immaculately conceived, as through an invisible hand, which is then assumed to justify or vindicate states as they presently exist. But I don't think from an institutional development point of view, Rothbard's strictures stave off the development of the state as such. As Roy Childs explains in his essay, The Invisible Hand Strikes Back, Paraphrasing Marx, our goal is not only to explain and justify the state. The point, however, is to abolish it. A monopoly on the use of force is undesirable, not only because it is force, but also because its status as a monopoly. We are not morally discouraged or confused with the use of force in the pursuit of justice, or in self-defense, or even, I submit, in acts of extreme desperation. For aesthetic convenience, think of the starving Jean Valjean stealing bread. Monopoly, on the other hand, is morally discouraging, and it blocks our every attempt to find a route around. Our moral confusion grows until we either submit or explode. Roderick Long points out in his article, Libertarian Anarchism, Responses to 10 Objections. With monopoly comes moral problems. Why us? What is so special about us? There's also incentive problems. Why should I attempt to improve production, offer a lower price or better quality? Leverage problems. If the monopolist doesn't like me for this reason or that, the price could become impossible to meet or impossibly contingent. And knowledge problems. How do I know I am offering the best product for the best price? Davi Katsia added to Roderick's list another important problem of monopoly. One very important objection to monopoly in the example of shoes, the desire for unusual or unique shoes, that is, creative liberty. One of the most offensive aspects of monopoly is the power it gives to say, this is how your shoes will be. If the state is understood as a monopoly, and with it comes an inevitable and compounding cascade of legibility, incentive, knowledge, and moral problems, then how do we guard against it? Where does the state come from? Is it like turning on a light switch, all of a sudden we have a state? Does it only come purposefully from one obvious direction? Or does it slowly fill the spaces available, prohibited or abandoned from any direction? Herbert Spencer offers a sociological continuum that ranges from the society of the militant type to the society of the industrial type, from the regime of status to the regime of contract. The militant society exalts loyalty, orderliness, bravery, and nationalism. Its institutions are insular, conspicuous, and rigid. The industrial type, by contrast, prizes novelty and personal liberty. It is suspicious of authority and nationality. Its institutions are less conspicuous and plastic. What makes this continuum approach insightful is that it offers us a framework for explaining the transition of a militant society into an industrial one, and vice versa, an industrial society into a militant one. Spencer anticipates or complements, I submit, William James and Robert Higgs. William James describes the moral equivalent of war as a social program that can be used to marshal and order society towards the achievement of progressive ends. Robert Higgs demonstrates the Higgs effect, or the ratcheting effect of war on society, leaving a net increase in state power, along with an increased desire and structural need for more war. For Spencer, war is also a dominant factor in the change of the industrial society into the militant one. But war is not alone. Monocentrism and polycentrism are also oriented along a continuum. Horace Turpé, in his article Between Monocentrism and Polycentrism, clarifies this relationship as oppositional. The meaning of polycentricity was understood both in the original 1961 article and later conceptual refinements in opposition to monocentricity, as a system with multiple centers of power and decision-making that are formally independent of each other. Monocentric systems, by contrast, have reduced singular or hierarchical centers of power and decision-making with fewer and fewer formally defined units. This reduction in the number of centers of power and decision-making can be accomplished in many ways, but two identified ways are known as monocropping and monotasking. Peter Evans describes monocropping as the imposition of blueprints based on idealized versions of institutions whose applicability is presumed to transcend national cultures and circumstances. Monocropping can also be achieved through the removal of what are perceived as useful or useless redundancies. Elinor Ostrom describes this in her paper, A Frequently Overlooked Precondition of Democracy. The dominant view of, quote, the dominant view of metropolitan institutions was that they are chaotic and incomprehensible. Given that scholars studying metropolitan service delivery arrangements could find no order to them, the reaction has been to recommend that metropolitan institutions should be radically consolidated and streamlined. Many articles, books, monographs, and reports written by urban scholars recommend the elimination of smaller jurisdictions and the creation of a few large general-purpose governments to produce all local services in a given metropolitan area. She goes on to document that these recommendations have led to the decimation of social capital, local agency, and participation, particularly in the administration of education. As Ostrom catalogs, currently as of 2002, the number of school boards in the United States is still around 15,000. Thus, around 75,000 citizens are serving on school boards instead of the 550,000 in 1932. One consequence of this effort was the elimination of an overwhelming number of opportunities for regular citizens to engage in local problem solving and politics. This reduction in the regular citizen's participation opens the door for what Butler Schaeffer, in his book Calculated Chaos, calls the division of purpose. What begins as a simple division of labor, a system of specialization designed to allow the work of a group to get done more efficiently, becomes a division of purpose, with group members segregated into a chain of command. Monotasking takes place when, to quote from Thandika Kandawire, institutional monocropping and monotasking in Africa, institutions are reduced to servicing a standard set of often imposed policies or tasks, and reduced from the endless institutional experimentation that renders them highly unstable and unpredictable. There is a focus on institutions as instruments of restraint, at the expense of regarding institutions as the raw materials and points of reference for social experimentation, development, and transformation. In summary, the state is undesirable because monopolies are undesirable. Monopolies are stupid, impractical, insular, authoritarian, and immoral. Yet monopolies are also emergent, or grow organically and incrementally. They creep into our social lives as either expedient solutions to unanticipated problems or fill in the gaps available or abandoned by regular citizens. The two parts of this that make up Freed Market Anti-Capitalism are designed around taking the concerns of these themes, Diffara and state by monocentrism, seriously. By rejecting one society, we are implicitly endorsing its opposite. But it is an opposite of wide open space. The American Mutualist and New Harmony participant Josiah Warren declares in his manifesto that, quote, "An impression has gone abroad that I'm engaged in forming societies. This is a very great mistake, which I feel bound to correct. Those who have heard or read anything from me on the subject know that one of the principal points insisted on is the forming of societies or any other artificial combination is the first, greatest, and most fatal mistake ever committed by legislators and reformers." To which Vincent Ostrom, in his book The Meaning of American Federalism, could sympathetically clarify, societies that place substantial reliance upon polycentric patterns of order present contestable options that must necessarily challenge systems organized on autocratic principles. The world cannot remain half free and half servitude. Each is a threat to the other. This is the prescriptive space of freed market anti-capitalism. A freed market critique discusses the ways we can identify damage and discover routes around it. Going back to Turpay, the monocentric-polycentric distinction refers to the character of an outcome of change, and thus constitutes a dyad of institutional change. The dyad works as a compass of institutional change, pointing towards one of the two ends of the dyad. An anti-capitalist critique, on the other hand, offers us insight into how we can avoid monocentric solutions and tendencies, maintaining the needed space for the effective use of our damage-identified, dependent, exploratory desires. Turpay again, this basic characteristic, the multiple centers of power, is the precondition of maintaining an open public realm. The open public realm, allowing for the functioning of various means of public contestation, represents a second condition of existence for polycentricity. Therefore, I submit, freed market anti-capitalism is such a polycentric order. But what are freed markets, and what is anti-capitalism? There are two mutually informing and critiquing parts, freed markets and anti-capitalism. First, it should be made clear that what I'm calling capitalism is an institutional structure that either is just an expression of monopoly privilege, the economics of states, if you will, or a bundle of cultural, ethical norms that suffer significantly from monocentric tendencies. Second, if you use the word capitalism, if your use of the word capitalism does not point to the economics of states or monocentric tendencies, then this critique does not apply to you per se, but it still may offer some waypoints for navigating our contaminated ideological context, avoiding vulgar libertarian and vulgar liberal mischaracterizations of our stateful status quo. Gary Chartier, in his article Advocates of Freed Markets Should Embrace Anti-Capitalism, offers a three-part distinction of capitalism. Capitalism 2 is clearly inconsistent with Capitalism 1, and so with a freed market. Under Capitalism 2, politicians interfere with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services to enrich themselves and their constituents. And big business influences politicians in order to foster interference with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges in order to enrich themselves and their allies. There are three ways in which Capitalism 3 might be understood to be inconsistent with Capitalism 1, and so with a freed market. The first depends on a plausible, even if contestable, view of the operation of markets. Call this the markets undermine privilege. According to markets undermine privilege hypothesis, in a freed market, absent the kind of privileges afforded the usually well-connected beneficiaries of state power under Capitalism 2, wealth would be widely distributed, and large hierarchical businesses would prove inefficient and wouldn't survive. Capitalism 2 is uncontroversial within libertarian discussions. The state's interference with the iterative interaction between individuals and groups is understood as the obvious violation of free association and trade. But the historical record, time and time again, shows that the state's interference is not random or unmotivated. The state interferes for a reason. Sometimes the reasons are personal, not motivated along or personal and motivated along political versus industrial class lines. To exact tribute, maintain jurisdictions, and expand borders. Sometimes it is at the behest of developing an empowered, privileged, plutocratic class to stifle competition through monopoly privileges on grants of land, eminent domain, incorporation, subsidies, outright murder, or legal recognition and support for questionable contracts. Kevin Carson refers to this as the subsidy of history. Through each act of state brutality, society is further deformed, sculpted, and conditioned into a submissive, desperate, dependent, propertyless, or powerless working, industrial, employed class, occupying the bottom segments of a pyramidal structure of privilege. The economic landscape we see today is not that is not the one that has been brought about through peaceful voluntary cooperation. Whatever semblance of voluntarism achieved or experienced has been in spite of and through struggle with this subsidy of history. The two-gun mutualist Sean Wilbur has likened the giant corporations dominating our economic landscape to exotic hothouse flowers, lovingly nurtured within the state's greenhouse. The flip side of this simile is that if the greenhouse were ever damaged or removed, the rest of us weeds would take them down or out. Clarence Carson, in his article Capitalism, Yes and No, makes the following observation. One dictionary defines capitalism as, quote, a system under which the means of production, distribution, and exchange are in large measure privately owned and directed. On the face of it, the meaning may appear clear enough. We can come in sight of the difficulty. However, if we turn the whole thing around and look at what is supposed to be signified, shutting out of our minds for the moment the word used to signify it, suppose that is that we have a set of arrangements to which the means of production, distribution, and exchange of goods are in large measure privately owned and directed. I am acquainted with such arrangements, both from history and from some present-day actualities. But why should we call such arrangements capitalism? So far as I can make out, there is no compelling reason to do so. There is nothing indicated in such arrangements that suggests why capital among the elements of production should be singled out for emphasis. Why not land? Why not labor? Or indeed, why should any of the elements be singled out? These 2 points are crucial. If the private ownership of the means of production is capitalism, then what is our critique of the status quo? If what we want is what we have, then what is the crisis? If the process that brought it about is what causes us anxiety, is there a similar anxiety that a history devoid of large-scale privileged violence might yield a non-capitalist outcome? If it would, could this, in turn, bring about or warrant a consequentialist longing for such a history, maybe a plan for the future? Regarding the second point, why single out one factor of production over others? Why capital over labor or land? Why material capital over social, human, or network capital? Kevin Carson addresses this point in his essay, Capitalism, a Good Word for a Bad Thing. This is a very telling set of priorities. Capitalism, as opposed to socialism, is not defined by the degree of economic freedom as such. It's defined by a particular institutional structure which is disproportionately to the benefit of a particular class of market actors. Capitalism, simply put, is the most honest term for the unfree market we live under. It is a system of, by, and for the owners of capital. So long as it retains the primary characteristics, it's capitalist, no matter how unfree the market. On the other side of this perspective is the freed market. This step away from the present tense is important here. A free market implies points on a map where this community has a free market but this community doesn't. But shifting tenses, we turn apologetics into a perpetual critique. We have William Gillis to thank for this innovation. He explains in his essay, The Freed Market, instead of referring to the behavior and dynamics of the free market, I refer instead to a freed market. You'd be surprised how much a difference a change in tense can make. Free market makes it sound like such a thing already exists, and thus passively perpetuates the red myth that corporatism and wanton accumulation of capital are the natural consequences of the free association and competition between individuals. But freed has an element of distance, and what's more, a degree of action to it, an implicit call to action. It moves us out of the present tense and into the theoretical realm of the after the revolution, where like the Reds, we can still use present-day examples to back theory, but we're not tied into implicitly defending every horror in today's market. Charles Johnson, in his introduction to the book Markets Not Capitalism, offers another oppositional continuum between the market form versus the market deformed. The market deformed points to discernible, identifiable violations of the market form, while the market form offers a never satisfied and searching critique of the institutional systems we find ourselves nested and embedded. Historically, within classical liberal, libertarian, and anarchist discussions, one of the challenges inevitably brought to the defense of the status quo is the question of social order. The status quo offers a semblance of order, legibility, regularity, and predictability. The light switch turns on the light bulb. We can go buy food at the market. Our enemies are kept at bay. How would this be accomplished without a state? The answer to this question is typically the invisible hand. A theory of spontaneous order explains that even in the absence of leadership or control, an order will emerge. But what kind of order will emerge? And what role, if any, can we play in deciding its outcome? There is a neutrality to the invisible hand. The order that emerges may be benign or malign. It merely offers us a side constraint against types of organizing and a warning against unintended consequences. One of the ways we can describe this dichotomy between the spontaneous benign order and the spontaneous malign order is with the term the invisible fist. The invisible fist is the emergent order that constrains our options and our lives, the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. The invisible fist can be used to offer insights into the invisible aspects of structures of oppression like sexism, racism, and heteronormativity. Ross Kenyon explains this operation and hints at a way out. Quote, "The acts of producing and consuming in and of themselves have no moral content. All a free market means is that what is effectively demanded will be efficiently supplied. And if we demand garbage, we will have garbage. This freedom to choose connotes the responsibility to choose well, and the world in which we might live, may not be very much better than the world we have now." So what is our way out? When it is obviously not the state? Emergent orders appear to be brute facts of this reality. Passivity is not an option, and withdrawal is defeat. Ken MacLeod describes the term of this way out in his article, Socialism on One Planet. A society of conscious and voluntary cooperation cannot be established unconsciously or unwillingly. It cannot be imposed from above or from outside or from behind our backs. As an Ostromite, panacea solutions are, to the best of my ability, removed from my strategic vocabulary. Yet, with that understanding, I would like to offer William Gillis's Invisible Molotov. The Invisible Molotov embraces emergent orders, not as the pious would embrace their deity, awed by its power or grace, but as the readied Aikido master, observant of its flow and eddies, prepared to turn, adding its force to their own, or using its inertia to deflect its fist into the ground. As William Gillis explains, for those of us interested in resisting and undermining coercive power, the issue is less of how a truly freed market might one day improve our lives, but rather how the faint sparks of freedom in the market today are already working against hierarchy, banditry, and the concentration of power, and how those sparks may be stoked. Therefore, our interest is not in the market's invisible hand per se, but in the invisible Molotov it carries. In conclusion, Kevin Carson steals our resolve. Our goal is not to assume leadership of existing institutions, but rather to render them irrelevant. We don't want to take over the state or change its policies. We want to render its laws unenforceable. We don't want to take over corporations and make them socially responsible. We want to build a counter-economy of open-source information, neighborhood garage manufacturing, permaculture, encrypted currencies, and mutual banks, leaving the corporations to die on the vine along with the state. We do not hope to reform the existing order. We intend to serve as its gravediggers. Thank you. So I'm way early. Wow, I was blazing through that. Okay, so we got plenty of time for Q&A, which I was hoping to have. So how can I help?
think you've stunned the audience.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, within left-libertarian critique, there's a ton of terminology that I try to fit into this talk. Yes?
What is left-libertarianism?
Okay. So left-libertarianism well, the way we regard it is it's an old form of libertarianism that goes back to an exemplar case would be Benjamin Tucker, who wrote a very powerful essay called State Socialism and Anarchism, where they agree and where they divide or diverge. And in that, he basically he's describing that people who advocate for free markets are actually called socialists, and that something happened in the language that changed. So that's one way of looking at it. Left libertarians, I like to trace it back to Karl Hess, and I'm not familiar if you're familiar with Karl Hess. He was the speechwriter for Barry Goldwater, and then he became a member of the SDS, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, an honorary Black Panther, member of the New Left. He was pretty radical, and he coined or identified the left-right spectrum as the left being those who have a strategic orientation towards the dissolving of power into the maximum number of hands, and then the right wing being wanting to concentrate power into the fewest number of hands. And interesting, in his critique, he actually places liberals on the right wing. So left libertarian, as I would define it, is it's the open opposition to patterns of structures of oppression like exclusion, deprivation, submission, and war, with this strategic orientation to the dissolving power into the maximum number of hands. And the libertarian aspect is one reading of the non-aggression principle as an expression of a thorough anti-authoritarianism. So libertarianism is now an anti-authoritarianism. So that's how I kind of encapsulate the left libertarian label. But the alliance of the libertarian left is a cornucopia of many different types of people who are all fixating on a certain number of puzzles.
So your term polycentric, what you're referring to is kind of diffusion of organized society rather than having one authoritarian-centric perspective on things. Many societies, if you will, doing their own thing.
Well, there's one way, like the technical definition is many points of power and decision-making with among as many formally independent units. So this allows for people, one way of looking at it, and one of the ways that they approached it when they wrote the original article, Vincent Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, they were looking at the effectiveness of being able to vote with your feet. So if your government wants to do something and you live near the border and that's a porous border, they want to go to war. If everybody just crossed the border, there's no war. So what if we were to make an institutional arrangement where one institution started to go crazy and we could abandon it, vote with our institutional feet, and if it was monocentric, you would have the collapse of society, but if it was polycentric, it would be stable. But yet we could also take immediate action against institutions that overstep their boundaries.
Would you distinguish that from panarchism, or consider that to be the same, just another word for panarchism?
It might be, I would say panarchism can fit into that narrative, but panarchism, I would say, depending on who you're reading and how they're addressing it, could be regarded as a one-size-fit-all type of model. Maybe some communities will do well with that type of arrangement, but some of them might want to have, like for example, not different types of religions in one area, but multiple churches of the same religion, which would also fulfill that requirement of polycentricism. So if one pastor or preacher got out of hand and started going beyond the bounds of the community, they could abandon his church for the one across the street. Does that answer your question?
How do you see the Free State Project fitting in with that paradigm? Moving.
Oh, sure. I mean, moving with your feet is one way. Offering a point of contest with the city council, or I'm not exactly sure how it works here. For example, I was involved with the Tulsa Occupy movement, and I would sit there and we'd listen, we'd go through all these conversations and talk about what we wanted. And it was lots of people coming together with all different concerns, and they were just kind of shocked that everybody was that concerned about these ideas. And I made a suggestion, a point of success. How do we know we're being successful with our occupation? I made a suggestion: if we can get parents and kids to participate, get families participating in this space, then we will have more people. It will be more relevant to the community. And then, if we were able to have somebody come to this space or this forum with a property dispute, we've won. They're no longer going to government to resolve or adjudicating process. They're coming to another group. It didn't happen, but I thought that would be a way of setting up another institutional order that would allow for abandonment of an old one easily.
It's an example of a bottom-up approach.
Exactly. The bottom-up approach is this idea of monocentrism, monocropping, monotasking. An interesting observation that Elinor Ostrom makes is that we as libertarians, we look at the state as this jurisdictional monopoly of the use of force, and we think that's bad. We're like, well, obviously we think that's bad. But non-libertarians think that that's good. And then what they look at the society around them, they go, what's wrong with Afghanistan or Yemen? They don't have a big enough state. They don't have a strong enough state. We need to make a better state. Centralize it. Make it stronger. Make it bigger. And if it doesn't work, it's not big enough. Make it bigger, bigger, bigger. So that's one way of looking at this top-down model, this one-size-fits-all. The solution to all problems is a bigger, badder, meaner state. It doesn't allow for self-critique because there's never not enough, right? They can just keep adding more and more and more. I guess they can, if everybody's dead, then I guess they can't. But that's one way of stopping the state, but not desirable, right? So.
I was wondering if you have any distinction between polycentric organizations and just decentralized in general, or if those are kind of similar.
Depending on how you're using the words, they can be synonymous. Polycentricism versus decentralism would be, polycentricism acknowledges points of power, where decentralism might be a critique beyond formally independent units, so it might go beyond. So it might not have the research that the Ostroms are bringing to this conversation, showing that polycentric institutional arrangements are not only stable but efficient and can manage resources in a common pool without access or without use or reliance on a state apparatus. So decentralism could be within Karl Hess's description of the left as a tendency or a motive or something we want to strive for, but I would want to state where that critique can kind of find a nice stopping point is polycentric orders. Though I don't think there's any problem with as many polycentric orders as you can have within your totality, but decentral, I think that would be the distinction between the decentral and the polycentral.
And certainly, I mean, in a freed market, people could try to totally decentralize stuff and compete with the polycentric.
Oh, sure. But then that would just be another point of power.
Yeah.
How do you, so one of the issues with government, why I guess it happens, I look at it as like mafia protection racket, except it's just expanded. It's like the ultimate mafia.
Mm-hmm.
So security-wise, if you do polycentricism, I can see how you can organize markets that way, organize churches that way, you know, all these different societal issues, charities that can be solved. But what about security? As soon as you set up a security organization, it kind of gets jealous of other ones. It turns into the mafia.
Exactly, and this is one of the Ostroms. They look at what's called the design principles of collective action. And one of the interesting parts of the design principle, one of the actual crucial parts of the design principles, is there's no separate group that does the monitoring. Everybody has to be empowered to be a monitor. There's no cop. Everybody is empowered to maintain and gain access and participation in the system. So she calls it many eyes or multiple monitors is what actually stabilizes the system. So when she's talking about common pool resources like a fishery where the whole community is reliant on this one pond and they've all figured out some way of divvying up, you get 2 hours on Monday, I get 2 hours on Thursday. If you have one cop who's supposed to be in charge of making sure you use only your 2 hours, then that cop can be bribed, that cop can turn his head, that cop can do all these other things. But if the whole community is watching and saying like, hey dude, you went over 2 hours, man, you're cutting in, you're depleting the resources beyond what the community, which you were a part of, has decided. So she recommends multiple monitors, which is interesting because it parallels very well with open source kind of methodology where you want many eyes make shallow bugs. So you want as many people with access to this information to find the problems, to identify the damage and route around it. So there's an interesting parallel, or at least overlap, with polycentric orders that Ostrom is talking about and the open source movement.
I actually came to libertarianism through open source software.
Oh yeah.
Through Eric Raymond in particular. But kind of related, one thought I'm having is ideas like polycentrism, I think, are probably a lot easier to implement as technology is advancing. Maybe you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the way, I like the way Kevin Carson regards technology. Technology he regards it as a force multiplier and an equalizer, but it's not the answer. There might be a better way of solving this problem by taking a step back or to the side, or taking that step forward. We were having a nice discussion about how to take care of agorist problems with getting into the black market and operating underneath the state by maybe having some sort of insurance program or some sort of pool that you pay into to get immediate access on where all the cops are. So so maybe you could actually get a discount on what you pay for the security service by having some sort of app where you can do a GPS location every time you see a cop. And so every time, if you locate 5 cops a month, you get $5 off of your monthly dues or whatever for the service. So that technology can help you in that way. But if it's not a one-size-fit-all thing, kind of.
I submit this is a really weird way of looking at the state, but when we were talking earlier about seeing the state as sort of a jealousy sort of motivated organization, kind of reminds me of that. There's an internet meme. It's called the overly attached girlfriend. Kind of reminds me of that, except this girlfriend will actually literally kill you or hire people to kill you. But at any rate, a question. What does the left and left-libertarianism mean for you? Like you talked about the traditions that left-libertarianism comes from, but what does the left signify to you personally?
Well, one of the traditional ways of looking at, so there's this old left concept, which is one of anarchist and classical liberal heroes. Or anarchist heroes is Joseph Proudhon, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and one of the classical liberal heroes is Frédéric Bastiat. And they both sat on the left side of the National Assembly, and that signified that they were against the monarchy, or they were against the established order. And if you follow this trend of the left is against what's the status quo, then the left, as I would define it, is what we have now is what I don't want, and that's why I'm left. I'm left of it. So that's one way of looking at it. And, but I would say, but that doesn't really give us any content. It just tells me how I stand in relationship to the world that I see. The content that is provided is through Gary Chartier's Deprivation, Submission, Exclusion, and War, and Karl Hess's strategic preference for getting to the society we want through the dissolution of power, not the concentration. Which becomes a strategic kind of question. We can't convert everybody to the same ideology, and I don't even know if we would want to, but we do have to find allies, since we're not going to be able to make everybody one-to-one to me and ideas. we have to find out allies. So the strategic component is, do we go work with allies that are going to partially move towards centralizing power, or are we going to try to ally with groups that are going to decentralize power, which requires us to have a kind of thinking about and talking about how they're decentralizing it and how they're centralizing it. But that's one way we can start to identify who our allies are in the bigger struggle.
I know you didn't use the term right libertarian, but sort of, calling yourself a left libertarian sort of begs that question. And do you agree that, say, someone who wants to reform the state to make it work more efficiently would be considered right?
Well,
whether conservative, libertarian, whatever you want to call them.
So the question is, well, what is a right libertarian if there's such a thing as a left libertarian? And it depends on how we're looking at it. It tends to be what we regard as what are the things that we want to change? What are our strategies? What are our targets, and what are our tactics, basically? So Samuel Konkin III had this interesting statement, and he says, you can't reform the state from the inside. You don't want to strip it down of its red tape, because as if you can kind of make it softer or mean or kinder or give it a human face, because as we know, when something has less red tape, like the market, what we want to be able to move faster and move in ways that are meaningful and can route around the damage. The state without the red tape is going to become more lethal, and it can become much more dangerous if it doesn't have this red tape. So we can let it ossify and fall apart and crumble away while we build the new society in the shell of the old. We build around it, we build in its cracks, and then we wedge it open and we break it apart. So there's James C. Scott has a great book called The Art of Not Being Governed, where he describes the Zomia as a culture, they're called the barbarians by the state, but from themselves they call themselves, or they're referred to as the Zomia, and they're the ones that have designed a culture to be ungovernable. And they live outside the state on purpose to avoid this taxes and conscription and regulation. So I think that's one of the ways that the agorist looks at it.
Can you tell me the name of that book again?
The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott. He also has another book called Seeing Like the State, which offers you an insight into how the state looks at the world. It can't help but look at the world as in certain categories. It's not designed to it looks at a forest as timber output, when that forest to you is where you hunt or where you live with your family. It doesn't regard you as legible. Another thing that happens with the state is that the state doesn't regard small businesses as legible. They don't regard us as important. What we can offer it is nothing. So it only goes to large corporations. For example, a good example was when they were bailing out the auto industry, they only bailed out the auto industries that it could see. There's tons of startup car manufacturing, little startup car companies that didn't get any bailout because the state didn't see them. They don't care. It didn't regard them as relevant.
So Elinor Ostrom's work is obviously very important to you. Why do you think her work should be really important to libertarians?
I think, well, Elinor Ostrom's work is, she's not a libertarian per se, but all of her stuff is stressed on a consensual bottom-up order, which I think can be readily adaptable for solving libertarian problems or addressing the non-libertarian to certain problems, talking to them on how to describe it. How much time do I got?
You got like 3 minutes.
Okay, so one of the things that Ostrom is going to offer us is, how do we maintain liberty? How do we keep it once we've got it? And she makes the case that we're going to need a community to be involved in it and participating in it and enjoying the benefits of it. And so we're all invested in it and want to maintain it. This goes into a very interesting conversation between it's called the Gothic idea of the state, And the Gothic idea of the state is that what the goal of good governance is to find a way to restrict the number of people who can gain access to power. So you want to limit it to a certain number of reasonable or good people, but that's the idea. Then you have this kind of neo-Roman or radical Republican theory of governance, which it's not about limiting the number of people with access to power. It's getting as many people as you can with access to power, so that they have the desire to maintain liberty over subjecting other people. The differences between looking at human beings' self-interest as a detriment to society or as a positive society, and neo-Roman radical Republicans look at most people's self-interest is to be free, so we don't have to really worry about them. We have to worry about them is when they depart from public life, and the people who want to live off of other people fill in the void.
Just a really quick follow-up question. If you could, for someone who wanted to start reading Elinor Ostrom or wanted an introduction to her work, do you have any recommendations?
Her book that she won the Nobel Prize, first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics, and her book Governing the Commons talks about the idea of the tragedy of the commons, different types of goods, how they're managed, and how the people can govern themselves and govern scarce resources without the state. And not only can they, but they have been forever. Say again? Governing the Commons? That's her principal popular book. But I recommend anything she's written. and the same thing goes with Vincent. I think he's very challenging on. And then anything by Alexis de Tocqueville addresses a lot of these ideas as well. The Ostroms are very influenced by the Tocquevillian, what they call Tocquevillian analytics, is what their term for polycentric orders maintaining a public realm where everyone has access not only to enjoy but to maintain liberty. So, I appreciate everybody who stayed. I know it's kind of a weird conversation, but I enjoyed it.